Through the reinforced viewport, the void rippled like broken glass, space itself bruised and fractured by the gravity wake of the black ship, cutting hard through dead sectors. Hull plating hummed under strain, kinetic buffers cycling heat as the ship's spine flexed against the pressure. Every inch of her carried scars, carbon scoring, blast welds, alien burns carved too deep to erase. She wasn't built to hide, but tonight she stalked like a predator, low on blood and lower on mercy. Wyatt stood near the tactical rail, visor down, breathing cold air recycled one too many times. Beyond the glass, nothing moved, but the sensors hissed their quiet warnings. Thermal blooms ghosted in and out, distant heat spikes vanishing before systems could tag them. False readings, maybe or maybe not. Selkirn hunting packs were known to run cold, their ships designed to bleed heat into the void, until they were little more than drifting husks waiting to bite. Inside the command deck, the lights ran low, consoles washed in ice blue and amber. Vadron's voice carried from the upper platform, sharp and wired, calling vectors and sweep patterns without looking up from the tactical holo. The morphic revenants weren't far. Everyone knew it. The black ship had punched through the command station in Chapter 10, but the moment they cut free, something had followed a tracking signal, subtle and layered into their heat trail, bending space like a wound that wouldn't close. Soren 4 ran diagnostics on his neural core, hands moving faster than human reflex should allow. His implants flickered between human pulse and machine rhythm, both syncing to the ship's heartbeat. He didn't speak unless the data required it. Right now, the data screamed. The revenants weren't just closing in. They were already here inside the void shadow, riding low on quantum bleed, tapping into the hull's own resonance. Ghosts pressed against the skin of the ship, waiting for the airlocks to falter or the bulkheads to forget their seals. Kaler's rifle clung to his chest plate, mag locked and ready. His fingers traced the weapon's edge like a prayer, muttering curses meant for old gods and new enemies. If the revenants breached, it wouldn't be a firefight. It would be slaughter, one heartbeat at a time, until the ship went dark and no one was left to scream. The black ship shifted course, engines cutting out in sequence, drifting now silent running, prey pretending not to breathe. But no one believed the lie. Wolves already scented the trail. Somewhere in the forward corridor, the emergency hatch groaned. Wyatt raised his rifle, and the bulkhead lights flickered once, then twice, then died. The hunt had already started. Wyatt's finger hovered just above the trigger, but it wasn't fear slowing him down. It was calculation, the brutal kind born from too many missions where firing first meant dying faster. His visor fed a tight data stream directly to his optic nerve, lines of biosignatures crawling like static, flickering between heat echoes and something darker, something the system couldn't classify. The bulkhead ahead of him wasn't just metal anymore. It was skin, breathing in slow pulses, as if the ship itself was trying to warn him. They were inside the walls, riding the circuitry, twisting the alloy bones of the black ship into something that could bleed. Vadron's voice cut through the channel, low and tight, the way it always got when death was about to shake hands. Status reports came clipped, each one feeding into the next until the command deck felt like the inside of a loaded weapon. Soren 4 moved along the upper catwalk, his augmented eyes burning violet, scanning not just for life signs, but for molecular disruptions, microfractures where reality itself bent wrong. His implants, once standard-issue human tech, had been retooled after his first encounter with the Revenants, when a fragment of alien code tried to rewrite his spine from the inside out. He survived by carving out the infected parts himself, leaving enough human to pass the next psych scan, but not enough to ever dream without metal crawling through his thoughts. Kaler broke from the wall, his boots magnetized just enough to stay silent against the deck plating. His rifle, old by black ship standards, bore the weight of a dozen scavenged upgrades. XL Kern heat vanes fused along the barrel, Dominion shard ammo clamped into the feed, and a custom scope salvaged from a dead human scout who saw too much before his brain cooked inside his skull. Kaler didn't pray because he believed. He prayed because the noise kept him from thinking about the last time he saw a revenant up close, when its face split open and inside was every voice he ever loved, screaming for him to come home. The bulkhead shuddered again, and Wyatt saw it this time the metal didn't dent or crack. It bulged, like something was pressing from the other side, but not with hands or claws. It was molecular, a forced fusion between alien biology and human engineering, where the revenants didn't need to breach the ship. They became the ship, folding themselves into the walls, the conduits, the air systems. One breath in, and you were already compromised. The black ship's filtration system cycled faster, scrubbing every molecule with particle blasts, but even that felt desperate, like trying to bleach rot out of bone. Vadran's orders came down: cold seal all non-essential sections, reroute power to localized magnetic fields, force the revenants into physical form if they wanted to kill. Wyatt didn't argue. He tapped his gauntlet twice, sending his squad into staggered formation. No one stood in a straight line. Straight lines got you harvested. They moved like broken signals, each step jagged, irregular, the kind of motion revenant targeting systems couldn't predict. But predictability wasn't the problem. The problem was the whisper threading through the comms, a sound no one activated, words in a language older than bones. Soren 4 froze mid-step, fingers twitching as his neural core locked up for 2.3 seconds, an eternity in combat time. His internal firewall burned red, shoving back against a cascading code burst that came not from outside but from the ship itself. The black ship was talking to him, screaming actually, in bursts of encrypted terror that didn't belong to any language programmed into its systems. It was ancient code, scavenged when humanity first found the ship drifting in a kill zone that predated the oldest wars. No one ever cracked that part of the code. They just built over it, hoping dead systems stayed dead. They didn't. Kaler's rifle twitched, the targeting reticle shifting left and right, not from his grip but from the weapon itself, like the smart scope couldn't decide if it was hunting something outside or inside the barrel. Wyatt keyed his visor, switching to thermal, then to motion tracking, then to raw EMF. Each feed told a different story. One showed empty corridors. One showed a dozen moving signatures. One showed the walls themselves breathing in slow, hungry waves. He didn't trust any of them. The bulkhead began to unseal, not from external force, but from the ship's own command lines. Internal systems flickered, responding to an authority higher than the crew, something nested deep in the black ship's heart, a protocol buried under layers of wartime encryption. Vadran's override codes spat back errors, as if the ship itself had decided command structure no longer applied. The bulkhead slid open, and the corridor beyond was dark, not just unlit but lightless, a vacuum of color and depth where even sensors refused to map. Wyatt stepped forward, rifle raised, knowing full well that the first shot wouldn't matter. The first shot was ceremonial, a human instinct too old to overwrite. The Revenant stepped into view, and it wore a face not a perfect match, but close enough to break the mind for half a second. Its skin wasn't skin, but braided filaments of ship metal and organic tissue, fused at the cellular level, rippling between forms as it moved. Its eyes held no color, just reflection, like two polished voids capturing every light source and giving nothing back. Kaler fired first, and the round tore through the Revenant's shoulder, splintering into fragments designed to disrupt molecular cohesion. It staggered, but only for the time it took to smile a smile made from borrowed muscles and teeth stolen from memory. It stepped forward, and behind it came more, each one wearing a different face, a different body, some human, some alien, some broken mixtures of both, all unified by the same hungry void behind the eyes. Soren 4's implants kicked into overdrive, flooding his system with countercode, firewall spikes burning white-hot along his spinal column. His voice came in bursts, half human, half machine, reading off corrupted system logs as his own body fought against the ship's failing defenses. Vadran's orders became static, words buried under layers of digital screaming as the black ship tried to quarantine itself, sealing entire decks behind molecular locks that shattered seconds later as the Revenants passed through them like mist through fingers. Wyatt fired, and the round hit center mass, detonating in a bloom of kinetic force and thermal shock. The Revenant absorbed it, flesh and metal parting like water before sealing again, the wound already forgotten. They couldn't be killed, not in any way that mattered. They had to be denied, starved of contact, cut off from the systems they needed to manifest. The only option left was to amputate sections of the ship, whole corridors, maybe entire decks, severed from the core before the infection spread. Vadran's voice returned, iron-hard and stripped of hesitation. Authorization granted. Section purge initiated. Wyatt barely had time to grab Kaler's harness before the deck beneath them glowed red, the purge charge detonating along a controlled line, turning the corridor into molten slag, cutting them off from the advancing Revenants. The ship screamed, not from pain but from betrayal because the black ship remembered. This wasn't the first time she'd been forced to butcher herself to survive. And every time it happened, she forgot a little more of who she used to be. Soren 4 hit the deck hard, neural overload sending him into temporary paralysis. Kaler's breathing came fast and sharp, adrenaline crashing against reality as the heat from the purge filled the air with the scent of burning metal and something far worse, something that smelled like memory. Wyatt keyed his comm, but Vadran's channel was dead. Not jammed. Just gone, like the command deck itself had been swallowed whole. The bulkhead behind them unsealed again, and this time there was no corridor. Just void, stretching inward, where the ship's heart should be. And from that void came a sound familiar, broken, and spoken in Wyatt's own voice. Welcome home. The fracture in the bulkhead sealed itself behind them, but Wyatt didn't need to turn around to know the void was still there, breathing against the metal like a second heartbeat. Kaler's boots ground against the deck, trying to find balance where there wasn't any, while Soren 4's fingers spasmed with ghost signals, his implants caught between purge damage and the ship's corrupted voice, trying to rewrite his spine again. The corridor ahead sloped down, deeper than schematics ever showed. There was no record of a lower deck beneath this section, but the ship had rearranged itself in silence, folding inward like a living machine that didn't know if it was birthing or burying something. Soren 4 tried to speak, but his voice broke apart into layered echoes. Not his words, but transmissions bleeding through him. It wasn't just the black ship talking now. Something older was whispering from below, and every step forward made it louder. Wyatt kept his rifle raised, but the targeting system flickered between weapons lock and maintenance error, as if the gun couldn't decide if it was still a weapon or part of the ship itself. Kaler's hand stayed near his blade, no tech, just metal honed to molecular sharpness, a last resort against enemies that didn't bleed right. They moved single file now, a corridor too narrow for standard formation, walls tight enough that their armor scraped with each step. Lights flickered along the floor, not overhead. Each pulse marked a path, flickering bioluminescence stitched directly into the alloy, veins of liquid code running beneath the surface. It wasn't human tech. It wasn't even exokern. This was older, predating both sides of the war, something the black ship had scavenged long before anyone knew its name. And now, something inside it wanted to be found again. Wyatt's HUD kept flagging environmental inconsistencies, air pressure fluctuating, temperature spikes sharp enough to leave frostbite on exposed skin, radiation signatures weaving in and out of measurable space like they couldn't decide which universe they belonged to. They passed a hatch that shouldn't have existed, its frame scarred from the inside out, not by explosives or breaches, but by hands' fingernail scrapes deep enough to gouge metal, human handprints left in blood that had crystallized into obsidian flakes. Kaler paused, fingers brushing the surface, and the ship responded, a tremor rolling beneath their feet, not from engines or external impact, but from something shifting within the walls themselves, like muscle clenching around bone. The air grew damp, not with condensation, but with breath, a warmth that came in irregular gusts, almost rhythmic but too broken to be mechanical. Wyatt keyed his visor to historical overlay, backtracking sensor logs to see who had passed through this corridor before. The feed glitched, then rolled backward faster than human eyes could follow, blurring into a smear of shapes and shadows, faces half-formed but familiar. Crew members listed as lost. Some from battles that happened years before Wyatt even boarded the black ship. Some who had never been crew at all. They were memories the ship itself was leaking, ghosts encoded into the bulkhead, playing out their last moments over and over like corrupted security footage with no off switch. Soren 4's hands snapped up, fist clenched in a signal Wyatt didn't recognize old code from an older war, predating their squad's protocols. Before Wyatt could question it, the wall to their left split open, not a hatch, but a seam appearing in the alloy like skin parting under a blade. Beyond it was a room none of them had seen before, its walls lined with machines that weren't entirely machines. Organic wiring pulsed, biometal tendrils coiling around storage pods the size of coffins. Each pod held a body, not alive, but not dead either, skin marked with the same bioluminescent veins running beneath the floor. Kaler's jaw tightened, lips moving in silent calculation as his tactical implants tried to identify the bodies. Some were human. Some were Dominion. Some were neither hybrid forms that shouldn't exist outside corrupted genetic theory. Each body showed signs of attempted integration foreign tech grafted into flesh, organs replaced with machinery that still pulsed despite being disconnected from any power source. This wasn't storage. This was a failed evolution chamber, where the black ship had tried to make something new from the dead it couldn't forget. Soren 4 stepped closer, his own implants pulsing in sync with the pods, a magnetic hum building in his spine like a tuning fork, resonating with itself. The ship recognized him. Not as crew, but as kin. Whatever had been done to his body after his first encounter with the Revenants, it had rewritten enough of him to make him part of this process, a half-formed answer to a question the black ship had been asking since it was first found. Wyatt grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back before contact could complete, and the room screamed, every pod convulsing as if the bodies inside were drowning in dry air. Kaler's blade came up fast, slicing through a tendril, reaching for Saren 4's ankle, the biometal snapping back with a wet hiss. The cut leaked not blood but data streams of code spilling across the floor, seeping into their boots, feeding directly into their suits' environmental systems. Emergency quarantine protocols engaged too late. The data wasn't just information. It was memory overwritten into their implants like a virus that carried sorrow instead of code. Wyatt's HUD filled with scenes from wars that never happened, battles fought in starfields no human had ever charted, faces he didn't recognize but felt like he should. The black ship wasn't showing them history. It was showing them futures it had already lived, timelines folded back into themselves every time the ship died and was reborn. The corridor ahead flickered, the walls shifting between solid metal and raw muscle, pulsing in time with the ship's damaged heart. They weren't alone anymore. Figures stood ahead, silhouettes cast from memory and imagination, each one wearing the armor of the first crew that boarded the black ship. None of them were real. None of them were whole. Their faces were blurred, features overwritten by every crew member who died aboard this ship, a collective ghost formed from every life lost to keep the engines burning. They didn't speak, but their mouths moved, forming words Wyatt couldn't hear but felt inside his skull, words the black ship had whispered to every captain who came before Vadran. You can't win. You can only choose how much you lose. The figures stepped back, merging with the walls, leaving behind a single object on the floor, a shard of obsidian metal, shaped like a blade, but too fractured to hold a true edge. It pulsed in time with Wyatt's heart, synced to his biometrics without contact. This wasn't human tech. It wasn't even alien. This was the black ship's heart fragment, torn free during the first battle it ever fought, a piece of itself that never healed. Taking it meant connection. Refusing it meant severance. Either way, there was no way forward without a choice. Soren 4's voice returned, ragged and layered with interference, his implants still fighting the ship's influence. He didn't argue. He didn't suggest. He simply stated the reality none of them could deny. If they didn't take the shard, the ship would stop protecting them. If they took it, the ship would stop pretending they were still human. Wyatt knelt, fingers closing around the fragment, and the floor beneath them split open, gravity reversing in a heartbeat, dragging them down into the dark below the deck, into a space no map had ever shown. As they fell, the ship whispered directly into Wyatt's mind, no longer using comms or implants. Just raw memory injected into thought, a single truth threading through every scream and prayer. The black ship was never just a weapon. It was a graveyard that didn't know how to die. And now, the wolves were awake, hunting something older than the war itself. The fall ended without impact, but the floor beneath them wasn't metal. It was flesh, ancient and cold, and from that flesh came a voice, older than the ship, older than the stars, calling Wyatt by name. Not the name he was given at birth. The name the ship gave him the first time he bled for it. The name was its own question. Its own curse. Its own key. And from the dark, something answered. The darkness wrapped around them like a living thing, thick, pressing, waiting. Wyatt's breath came sharp, controlled, but beneath it, the ship's whisper lingered, threading through his mind like oil slipping through cracks. He clenched his fingers around the shard, feeling its pulse sync with his own, a foreign rhythm that wasn't human but had learned how to mimic one. Kaler landed beside him, boots scraping against the unnatural flesh beneath them, blade held low but ready. Soren 4 dropped last, his augments flickering, failing, rebooting in a constant loop, as the ship and whatever was beneath it tried to claim him for themselves. This isn't the same deck, Kaler muttered, voice low, like speaking too loud would wake something waiting just beyond the edge of their perception. No, Wyatt agreed. It isn't. The floor wasn't metal. It wasn't entirely organic either. It shifted under their weight but held firm, like a surface pretending to be solid just long enough to trick them into believing it. The air was thick with something more than oxygen memories, voices, echoes of past lives embedded in the very atmosphere, pressing against their skulls like too many thoughts trying to force their way in at once. Sauron 4 exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. This place is rewriting me. His voice was strained, layered, flickering between his own tone and something deeper, something older. Wyatt turned to him, scanning his systems through the shared HUD. You still in control? For now. Kaler's grip tightened on his weapon. Define for now. Sauron 4 let out a dry laugh, more machine than man. If I start repeating things that haven't been said yet, shoot me before I finish the sentence. Wyatt didn't laugh. Neither did Kaler. A sound rippled through the space, something vast shifting, not movement but the suggestion of it, the kind of presence that made even silence feel loud. Wyatt didn't turn his head toward it. Turning meant acknowledging it. Acknowledging it meant letting it know they saw. Instead, he focused on the passage ahead, a corridor that shouldn't be there, stretching into black, lined with walls that pulsed like the inside of a creature's throat. Kaler stepped forward first. Standing here isn't an option. Wyatt followed, and Sauron 4 fell into step beside him, his hands twitching every few seconds like his body was processing commands no one had given. The deeper they moved, the more the ship's presence thickened, no longer distant, no longer passive. It was here. It was watching. And it was waiting for something, an answer, a decision, a sacrifice. Sauron 4 broke the silence first. You ever wonder if the ship's fighting against us or trying to prepare us for something worse? Wyatt didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't know. He never had. Kaler glanced back, expression sharp. If this is preparation, I'd hate to see the main event. They moved deeper. The walls narrowed, closing in, forcing them to step single file. Every inch of space they left behind sealed shut, as if retreat was no longer an option. The ship wasn't giving them a way back. Only forward. Then they saw it. A figure stood at the corridor's end. Not Dominion. Not human. It wasn't even fully formed, shifting, flickering, a body that hadn't decided what shape to take. The only thing constant was its eyes. Cold. Knowing. Watching. Wyatt raised his weapon. Identify. No response. Kaler tensed beside him. If it moves. The figure did. Not forward. Not backward. It simply was, and then it wasn't, appearing inches closer in the space of a blink. Sauron 4 exhaled sharply. That's not a person. Wyatt didn't lower his weapon. No. The thing's voice came then. Not spoken. Not projected. Just there, slipping into their minds like a thought they had never meant to think. You are not the first to come this far. Kaler's knuckles whitened around his blade. That so? You will not be the last. Wyatt kept his stance level. What are you? The thing tilted its head, considering. A record. A pause. A slow shift, as if the shape it took was being rewritten in real time. A warning. Sauron 4's breathing hitched for half a second. I know what this is. Wyatt didn't take his eyes off the figure. Explain. Sauron 4's voice was quieter now. It's an echo. A remnant of something the ship absorbed. Maybe crew. Maybe something else. But it isn't here to kill us. The figure blinked out again, reappearing just behind them. No. I am here to see what you will choose. Wyatt turned, keeping his weapon raised. Choose what? To end it. The ship groaned around them, a sound like steel grinding against bone. Or let it begin again. The corridor shifted. The walls pulsed, and beyond them, something massive stirred. Kaler's jaw clenched. I'm getting real tired of cryptic. The walls split. And from the dark, something came through. The thing that came through the split in the wall didn't walk, didn't crawl, didn't even register as a body. It was presence first, form second, motion third. Like the ship itself had exhaled a piece of memory too dangerous to keep buried but too important to destroy. It filled the corridor in a single heartbeat, folding space around it, turning the narrow passage into something that stretched wider and longer the more they stared at it. Wyatt didn't lower his weapon, but he knew deep down no projectile, no blade, no burst of plasma would matter here. This wasn't something that could bleed. It was something that remembered bleeding. Sauron 4's augments flickered again, but this time they didn't reboot. They went dark. The neural relay in his spine, the system that made him faster, stronger, better silent. His breathing slowed as the blackout reached his autonomics, and for one long moment, Wyatt saw the realization settle into his eyes. He was just flesh again. A broken man standing inside the belly of a beast built to consume both body and soul. Kaler raised his blade, the edge humming faintly as its monomolecular surface tried to resist the reality warping around them. Orders? Wyatt's voice came low. Stay human. Kaler didn't ask what that meant. He just held his ground. The thing twisted. Not a movement. A restructuring. 1 second it was tall and angular, a shadow bent forward on too many limbs. The next it was flat and wide, stretched into the floor like a reflection staring back at them from a pool that shouldn't be there. Its voice came without sound, threading into bone marrow, not ears. You have carried the shard too long. Wyatt's grip tightened instinctively around the sliver of alien tech fused into his glove, the fragment ripped from the Dominion's throat in a battle none of them should have survived. It had saved them then. But survival came with debts. And now the debt was being called in. Kaler glanced at the shard. What the hell is it talking about? The thing pulsed, a ripple through space and sense, and suddenly the corridor wasn't empty anymore. They stood on a battlefield not their own. Human soldiers, faces unknown, weapons unfamiliar, fought against twisted shapes that might have once been Dominion, but were now something else entirely, flesh rewritten by the same corruption eating at the walls around them. Wyatt knew this wasn't a memory they should have access to. This was the shard remembering for them. Sarin IV clenched his fists, but without his augments, there was nothing to channel. The shard is a beacon. Wyatt's stomach dropped. It's more than that. The thing that spoke without speaking pulsed again, and now the battlefield flickered, fast-forwarded, showing the aftermath. Human corpses stripped of identity. Dominion carcasses melted into the metal beneath them. And in the center, a single figure standing upright, holding the same shard Wyatt now carried. But the figure's face, Wyatt recognized it. Not a reflection. A future. A warning. It was him. Kaler took a half-step back. That's not possible. Wyatt swallowed hard. It's not a warning. The thing's voice cut through again. It's a cycle. Sarin IV's breath caught. We've been here before. The shard pulsed against Wyatt's palm, and the battlefield vanished, leaving only the corridor once more. But now the thing filled every inch of it, pressing against them without touching, skin to skin without contact. Choose, it said. Break the cycle or become the next echo. Kaler's blade trembled slightly in his hand, the first crack in the sergeant's unshakable calm. What does that mean? What cycle? The walls pulsed again, this time slower, almost mournful. The cycle of betrayal, of survival at the cost of what makes you human, of the shard rewriting you until you're something the ship can use. Wyatt's throat went dry. The shard's not a weapon. It's a seed. Sarin IV's voice came cold. A seed for what? The thing shifted closer. For the ship itself. Each bearer feeds it. Each bearer shapes it. Each bearer dies. And the ship remembers. Kaler shook his head. That's not possible. The ship's ancient, older than memory. The thing agreed. And every captain becomes part of it. Wyatt's pulse hammered against his skull. I'm not the captain. Not yet. The walls split again, this time in front of them, not behind. Through the gap, Wyatt saw the bridge, not as it was now, but as it had been before the war. Before humanity had seized it from the Dominion. Before it had been swallowed by the Black. Human voices shouted orders in languages he didn't recognize, faces unfamiliar but expressions all too known: fear, defiance, resolve. In the center stood a man holding the shard, just like him. And as the battle raged, the man turned, and Wyatt saw his own face again. But older. Broken. Less human, Kaler whispered. That's not you. Wyatt's jaw clenched. Not yet. The thing's voice slipped in again. Choose. Take the shard to the core and become the next captain. Or destroy it and let the ship die. Sarin IV's fingers twitched, his body instinctively rejecting both options. There has to be another way. There is not. Kaler exhaled hard. What happens if we do nothing? The thing twisted again, folding in on itself, shrinking until it was a mirror reflecting only their faces back at them. Then you become the next memory. The next warning. Wyatt stepped closer to the shard, the weight of it suddenly unbearable, like holding a dying star in his palm. If I destroy it, what happens to us? The ship will die. You will die. But the cycle will end. Soren 4's voice came sharp. And if you take it to the core, you live. The ship lives. But you are no longer you. Kaler shook his head. That's not a choice. That's a sentence. Wyatt's fingers hovered over the shard, every nerve screaming for him to let it go. But the ship pulsed beneath his feet, alive, aware, waiting. Kaler's voice lowered. We fight our way out. We find a third option. There is no third option. Wyatt met Kaler's eyes. There always is. The thing shuddered, its form flickering as though the very suggestion of defiance was enough to disrupt it. Soren 4 clenched his fists again. You said every captain becomes part of the ship. But what if the ship becomes part of the captain? The thing's silence was answer enough. Kaler grinned faintly. You don't know. You've never seen it. Wyatt's pulse steadied. Let's show it. The walls cracked, the floor split, and the corridor collapsed inward. The thing screamed without sound, a tremor through the marrow of the ship itself. Wyatt clutched the shard, not letting it guide him this time, but pulling it into his own grip, shaping its purpose rather than being shaped by it. Soren 4 grinned darkly. Override the override. Kaler raised his blade. No cycle. No surrender. The thing reformed, larger now, desperate. You do not understand. Wyatt's smile was razor thin. We never do. And then the corridor split apart, dropping them into the core itself, where the heart of the ship beat not with technology or alien science, but with the memories of every captain before him, their faces flickering in the walls, waiting for him to join them or to end them. The choice wasn't made. The shard pulsed like a second heart in Wyatt's hand, every throb spilling memories that weren't his, thoughts not born in his mind, ghosts older than humanity itself whispering in languages his tongue could never form. The core chamber swallowed them whole, closing the rift behind like a wound healing over, sealing flesh around a bullet too deep to pull out. The air was wrong in here, if air even existed this deep inside the ship, but breathing wasn't the point anymore. This was where captains came to either become something more or be erased completely. Kaler's grip on his blade was white-knuckled, knuckles stretched bone-tight. Soren 4 stood beside him, augments still flickering between life and death, systems caught in the same limo the rest of them had been thrown into. No orders came over the comms. No reinforcements followed them in. Just silence. And the silence was watching. The core wasn't a machine in the traditional sense. It was a living scar, a mass of tech and flesh and memory sutured together by every decision every captain had ever made. Pulsing veins of liquid metal twisted through the walls, humming with encoded thoughts so ancient no species alive had ever spoken them aloud. Faces drifted across the surface, flickering like reflections on a disturbed pond, each one staring directly at Wyatt. They knew him. They expected him. They feared him. He held the shard up to the core, the final act in a script every captain before him had followed. Place it in the cradle, bond with the ship, become the next name on the wall. Memory into memory, until no one remembered who the first captain was, or why they ever stepped aboard. The cycle was perfect because it had no beginning left to find. Soren 4's voice came thin, strained through grit teeth. If you do this, you're gone. No coming back. Not you. Just the ship wearing your face. Kaler's voice came harder. And if you don't, the ship dies. We die. It's built to need a captain, not a passenger. Wyatt lowered the shard an inch, the weight of it enough to feel like holding the history of every war humanity had ever lost. The shard wasn't a command key or an interface. It was a seed because it planted something inside every captain who held it. A slow, quiet infection that rewrote loyalty into purpose, individuality into function. It didn't matter who they were before. It only mattered what the ship needed them to be. He looked at the walls again, at the faces floating in the metal. One of them looked like him. One of them was him. A future he hadn't lived yet. Or a past he'd already forgotten. Kaler stepped forward, voice low but unshaken. We fight our way out. We cut the seed out. We burn the roots. The ship needs a captain, but not a slave. The core's pulse slowed, listening. The ship heard him. And the ship disagreed. A tremor ran through the floor, subtle but deliberate, like a muscle tightening before a strike. They weren't inside a ship anymore. They were inside something alive enough to know fear and angry enough to crush it before it took hold. Wyatt held up the shard again, this time not toward the core but toward the faces inside the wall. You want me to join you. The faces flickered faster. Then show me. The core buckled, the wall stretched, and suddenly Wyatt wasn't standing in the chamber anymore. He was standing inside the memories themselves. 1,000 bridges across 1,000 wars, each one lit by the same cold light, each one manned by a captain holding the shard. Some were human. Some were not. Some were species wiped from every record the Dominion had ever kept. But all of them were the same, in the end commanders who stopped being people the moment they took the shard into their hand. The memories burned through him like fire, not in pain, but in clarity. He saw the first captain someone who wasn't human, wasn't Dominion, wasn't even from this galaxy. A creature born from the same black the ship now sailed through. The first bearer. The first to bond. And the first to die inside the walls, forgotten by name but remembered by function. That was the cycle. Become. Serve. Forget. Repeat. Soren IV's voice dragged Wyatt back to reality, sharp and urgent. You're bleeding. Wyatt looked down. Blood ran from his nose, his eyes, his ears, leaking like the ship itself was trying to rewrite him from the inside out. The shard wanted in. The ship wanted him to stop resisting. Kaler's blade hovered beside him, not threatening, but reminding. You don't have to do this. Wyatt smiled faintly. I know. He turned, facing the core, but this time, instead of placing the shard into the cradle, he crushed it in his fist. The metal splintered, not like tech, but like bone snapping under pressure. Blood and oil mixed in his palm, the liquid seeping into his skin before anyone could react. The walls screamed not in sound, but in memory. The faces twisted, some vanishing, some merging into one another, and the core itself dimmed, heartbeat fading. Kaler stepped back, stunned. What did you just do? Soren IV's augments rebooted instantly, power flooding back into his frame like the ship itself had let go of his systems. He broke the seed. Wyatt's smile turned sharp. The ship wants a captain? Now it's got one. But it's not gonna like what comes next. The floor split, not from damage, but from choice. The ship didn't know what to do anymore. For the first time in countless cycles, the captain wasn't obeying the script. The seed was gone. The cycle was broken. The ship had no orders to follow. Kaler raised his blade again, grin matching Wyatt's. So we're free? Soren IV shook his head slowly, eyes locked on the walls. Not free. Just dangerous. The faces in the metal flickered faster, no longer watching Wyatt with expectation but with fear. The ship knew what came next. Unchained, unscripted, unbound. The black ship had never had a captain like this. Wyatt wiped the blood from his nose, the faintest trace of metal still lingering in his veins. We write our own orders now. The core flickered once, then went dark. Not dead. Just silent. Waiting to see what the first human captain would do with a ship no longer bound to any memory but his own.